Hello, everybody, and welcome to another day of Poly 130 virtual version. Today, we're going to continue our discussion about ethnicity and ethnic attachments. But quickly, just some housekeeping things before we start. So, I mentioned last class that your paper topics have been released. They're up on Sakai. So, if you go under the assignments tab, you will see all of the topics for paper 2. There's also, I released the other day, topics for the reading reflection this week if you intend to do a reading reflection. The reading reflection, if you're doing it this week, is due by Sunday. At 11:55 p.m. You'll turn those into your TAs, and your paper topics are due on April 13th, and those also need to be turned in on your section website or to your TAs in the way that they've described to you. Please do not submit your paper to the big Sakai site, the big course Sakai site, because we won't be able to find it. The other thing is that I posted a bonus lecture on electoral systems for ethnically or for divided societies. And I would really recommend that you check that out, particularly in advance of your paper. It goes through some of the readings that we didn't get a chance to lecture on that you did the week that you did your midterm. So definitely check that out. It's not too long, so it should be easily digestible. Okay, so to get into the topics for this week, we're gonna it's gonna be a pretty short lecture. We already kind of went over, the questions of what ethnicity is and why it's important, and so we're gonna continue on with our question of how it is that people form their ethnic attachments, and how those ethnic attachments eventually become mobilized into conflict. And if you'll recall what we did last class, we started in on this question by outlining 5 different theories that help us to understand how people form their ethnic attachments and what we expect to happen with ethnicity and how we expect the concept to evolve. We went through modernization theory, which predicts that ethnicity will eventually kind of fade into the background. And as we develop economically, we went through Marxist theory, which considers ethnicity to be a false consciousness um, that will be kind of overcome by class conflict. Primordialism, this idea that ethnicity is kind of inherent, fixed, and that any ethnic differences are due to kind of these immutable hatreds that cannot be changed or modified over time. And then today, actually, we're going to cover instrumentalism and social constructivism. So last class, we went through these first 3 theories, and we saw that there were some problems with them. In particular, we saw that for modernization theory, ethnicity actually hasn't disappeared over time. People still attach a lot of importance and salience to their ethnic identity. Moreover, ethnic affiliations may have gotten worse in the face of modernization. And I mentioned the case of Bolivia, where we saw people kind of expressing more attachment to their ethnic indigenous identity as a conflict broke out over whether oil rights should be allotted to the indigenous communities in which the oil is located, or whether the revenue should go to the Bolivian state. And so we saw the growth of really indigenous peoples movements in Bolivia coincident with their economic development and growth. For Marxist theory, we saw examples of how ethnic struggles might undermine class struggles. So in the U.S., there has been some conflict between kind of low-skill workers of different races. So particularly low-skilled African-American workers have expressed some trepidation over the growth of immigrant populations who also are low skilled workers, right? And worrying that they're going to take low skilled jobs and that there won't be enough kind of to go around for everyone. And in that case, people hold very strong to their ethnic attachments, despite the fact that they are of the same class, because that there's now interclass competition. And then finally, with primordialist theory, even though we saw some real evidence for primordialism in kind of the experimental study that I mentioned by Habyarimana and co-authors, the problem is that ethnic categories often aren't fixed, right? They change over time. So the meaning of if you can look again at the American case, it used to be the case that Irish people were of a distinctly different ethnicity that was not subsumed in the white category, right? Going back to times like the 1920s, there used to be signs in the window that said no Irish need apply, right? And so there was a form of kind of interracial ethnic discrimination against Irish. Now, obviously today, Irish people are well subsumed under the category of white Americans, right? They now to be Irish, yes, is somewhat distinct from being maybe Italian, but you are still in America at least considered a part of white America. And so these categories can change a lot over time. And if you played the race game, which a lot of you did, it you saw that it's even very hard to identify who your co-ethnics are and who they aren't, particularly as we see a lot of interracial mixing. I'd say that the average number of responses out of 20 that people are matches out of 20 that people got right was about 6. So people did not do very well at this game, kind of highlighting how difficult it is to kind of believe in these primordial theories that ethnicities are fixed, that we can easily recognize them, and that we can easily form opinions and preferences based on our ethnic identities. So today we're going to look at 2 different theories of ethnic attachments, instrumentalism and social constructivism or institutionalism. And we're going to start off with instrumentalism. So instrumentalism really embraces this idea that ethnicities are fluid and not fixed, and it sees ethnicity as a device that groups use to try and mobilize populations to achieve larger goals. In this case, ethnic identification is actually a strategic choice, right? It recognizes that not only is ethnicity fluid, but it can be very diverse, right? One person can hold multiple different ethnic attachments in themselves at once, and which one they choose to kind of express to others, which one they choose to show, is very strategic. And usually that choice is made to optimize some other type of goal, some type of economic goal or some type of political goal. So we can take a case like Ilhan Omar, who's a representative in the United States Congress, and clearly she is a Black woman, right? We can tell that, but she's also Somali. She is also Muslim. So this is a person with multiple ethnic identities all at once, right? And what instrumentalism suggests is that because ethnicity is so fluid, and because people can use it very strategically, she might decide to highlight different parts of her ethnicity depending on the audience that she's talking to and depending on what she is trying to get out of any particular interaction with someone. So if she was, campaigning for president, for example, and she wanted to appeal to Black voters in the South, she might highlight her experiences as a Black American citizen. Now, obviously, she she's an immigrant from some. Oh, well, I guess that disqualifies her from even becoming president at this point. But let's still go with the hypothetical. So so she clearly was not, born in the United States and maybe doesn't have the entire Black American experience, but she might highlight her identity as a Black American citizen in order to appeal to Black voters. If she then were to go to a rally in, let's say, Dearborn, Michigan, she might not highlight as much her Black identity because Dearborn, Michigan is a more Arab Muslim town, but she might highlight her Muslim identity, right? And suggest that she understands what's going on in the community of Dearborn because as a Muslim, she understands, you know, Muslims' preferences, the kind of Muslim way of life and their experiences within America. If she is in her home state of Minnesota, then that is where she might start to highlight her Somali identity because there are a lot of Somali immigrants who live in Minnesota. And so these different parts of her ethnic identity can be instrumentally used or strategically emphasized such that she can appeal to different groups and win more political votes. That also might help her in other ways. You can think of maybe in the economic realm, it might be more useful to highlight your Black identity than your Muslim identity. You never know. But that's kind of what the theory is suggesting. And on the kind of individual side, we see this happen a lot in terms of voting, right? Ethnic voting. So if we were to look at a primordialist description of voting, what we would assume is, okay, because I'm a Black American, I am always going to vote for any Black American candidate that comes to the fore, right? So, and the reason I would do that is because I assume that a Black American candidate is going to try to enact policies that are in line with my preferences as another Black American. So perhaps they're going to focus on putting more high quality schools in Black neighborhoods. Perhaps they're going to focus on putting other public goods like hospitals. Perhaps they're going to focus on lowering I guess, mandated minimums on sentences that disproportionately affect Black people, things like this. And so that is what primordialism would assume, right? As a Black American, I'm going to vote for Black American candidates. But what instrumentalism would assume is that my choices are actually much more fluid, and it depends very much so on kind of what is strategic for me to do based on the kind of ethnic demography around me, right? So I don't just kind of automatically vote for people that look like me. I vote for people who can align with my preferences the most. So if we can consider a situation like the situation we have in panel A here, where I'm a Black American, right, this black dot, but I'm in a county with a lot of white triangles. And if there is a white triangle candidate and a black dot candidate, and the black dot candidate says, okay, what I'm going to do is in areas that are populated by a lot of Black dots, I'm going to give them hospitals, I'm going to give them new schools and small business grants. And the white triangle candidate says the same thing for areas that are white triangles. Well, clearly, as a Black dot, ideally I would have the black dot candidate, but there are not enough black dots around me for this to be a black dot dominated area. So if the black dot candidate won, he would put all of those goods in a different area. He wouldn't actually allocate them to where I live. So it is in my best interest to vote for the white triangle candidate because she is promising to put those resources in an area like mine. It's also possible that if my ethnicity could be easily hidden, right? If I could just highlight the fact that we're all shapes rather than highlighting the fact that I'm a black dot, I might choose to do that, right? I might choose to try and assimilate into this white triangle demography rather than highlight my features as a black dot. Now here in a mixed area where there are tons more black dots, I have different preferences, right? Now it is fine for me to vote for the black dot candidate because there are several other black dots who will vote for that candidate, and we have a chance to win and get those resources allocated to our area. So that kind of shows you how instrumental ethnicity can be. In one place where it's not useful to vote for the black dot and perhaps act as a black dot, I won't, right? I'll try to assimilate into this neighborhood of white triangles. where it is useful for me to do so, where I can gain more for myself by expressing my identity as a Black dot and voting in line with that identity, then that is exactly what I'll do. And a really cool place where we can kind of see this outside of a hypothetical is the study that you read by Claire Adida about Benin. So Benin is a really kind of small country in West Africa. If you haven't seen it on a map, I would say look at it. It's kind of next to like Togo and Ghana, other places. But the really cool thing about Benin is that its president, Boni Yeyi, or his name is Thomas Boni Yeyi, is of mixed ethnicity. So there are there are at least three major ethnicities in Benin, and they fall along demographic lines. So the Barinda dominate kind of the north of Benin here. The Nego dominate the center area of Benin, and then the Fond kind of dominate the lower part of the southern part of Benin. And so we can see voting patterns for Yeyi in the 2006 election match up with this a lot. So Yeyi is of, like I said, mixed ethnicity. He is part Barinda, so this community here in the north, and he is also part Nego. His father is Nego, his mother is Barinda. And we can see that he won a lot of the vote in 2006 in these areas. He dominated the vote in Barinda and Nego areas, and actually got a fair amount of the vote in the Fawn area in the south. And so what Claire is trying to do in her study is figure out, okay, did he dominate these areas because of his ethnicity, and can one get a kind of ethnic bump, right? Can we visibly measure people's preference for voting for their ethnicity if we trigger recognition of that ethnicity, right? So what she does is she gives people just a kind of blanket statement about Yeyi Boni, and tries to just see if they're going to vote for him in the next presidential election. The statement is rather neutral, right? It says some good things about him, and then says some bad things about him. So in general, you would think, okay, if the person wants to vote for, if the person thinks that Boni is a good candidate, then they'll probably vote for him. If they want to focus on the negative things, they won't. It'll probably end up as a neutral. But what she does in this experiment is to trigger this idea of, okay, can we convince people to vote instrumentally based on ethnicity? What she does is she kind of frames this as an experiment. So everybody gets some version of this prompt. In the control group, they get just this prompt, nothing more. In condition one, there's a sentence at the beginning of the prompt that emphasizes that Yeyi Boni is born of a Nego father, right? It kind of emphasizes the ethnicity of his father. In condition two, it emphasizes the ethnicity of his mother as Bariba. And what she wants to see is, okay, does this change how people vote? If we can trigger identification with a certain ethnicity, will people be more likely to vote for Boni or not? And in fact, that is what we see, right? In the full sample, if we trigger this co-ethnic identity, right? We show people that he is either Boni or Barinda or Nego. We see about an 18 percentage point jump in whether they're likely to vote for Yeyi. Now, this is also true in the co-ethnic sample. This is particularly true in the co-ethnic sample. So if you trigger to people if you kind of emphasize for them that Yeyi is of Nego identity and they are of Nego identity, they're going to be more likely to instrumentally vote for him, right? That kind of triggers the fact that they're Nego. It makes it more important for them. And so they're going to be more likely to vote for that candidate. The same thing exists if you're Barinda. you end up being more likely to vote for him if they emphasize that he is Berenda. And that is a 16.6 or it's a 16% percentage point jump in your likelihood of voting for Yeyi, and both of these effects are significant. Now, if you're not a co-ethnic of him and you've been triggered of his ethnicity, you're actually not much more likely to vote for him. And that is whether you are of the Fon ethnicity or you just have an ethnic mismatch. So there we can see that we can kind of trigger people to identify with a certain type of ethnicity just by kind of engaging in this experimental condition. And so that is why we can kind of understand how he managed to win votes in these different areas. It's because he was able to, in the northern area, for example, present himself as a person of Berenda identity, thus forming an ethnic attachment with those people. Whereas in the south, he didn't highlight that part of his, or in the center rather, he probably didn't highlight that part of his ethnicity, right? He highlighted a different ethnic identity, thus triggering people in a very different way, and therefore he was able to capture all parts of this vote, right? Um, the other thing is this is very interesting because it doesn't just extend to him, right? We can see how ethnicity can be used instrumentally even more so by looking at how his wife was able to kind of manipulate ethnicity to be able to use it as instrumentally. So, like I said, Yeyi is of mixed ethnicity, right? Mixed ethnic heritage, being part Nego and part Berenda. Whereas his wife Chantal is of Fon heritage. So Claire Adida and co-authors, Adeline Lowe and others, did another experiment in Benin. And what they did this time is they gave a prompt about Yeyi, somewhat similar to the prompt that we saw earlier. But in condition one, so in the control condition, all you had was the prompt. But in condition one, they mentioned that he had a wife. They didn't say anything about her ethnicity. They just kind of mentioned that he was being accompanied by his wife. And then in condition two, they mentioned the ethnicity of his wife, right? They mentioned that she was Fon. And what they found is that Fon, when they got the kind of prompt that his wife was Fon, they were actually 20% more likely to vote for Yeyi than those Fon persons that did not get that prompt, just got, a prompt that mentioned his wife or the plain control prompt. And this is really interesting. So not only can you instrumentally benefit from ethnicities that you actually hold, right? Things that are a part of you, but you can also kind of capitalize off of other people's ethnicity that is close to you, right? You can highlight that you have connections with others, ethnic groups. So that's kind of like, oh, I have a Black friend type of thing. And you can benefit from that either politically or economically. So it doesn't have to be ethnicities that you hold. You can actually instrumentally use other people's ethnicities for your own political gain. So there are, however, some problems. Even though this experimental evidence is really cool and pretty significant, there are some problems with instrumentalism. One of the problems is that ethnicity isn't actually as fluid as instrumentalism will predict, right? Yeyi and Ilhan Omar have the benefit of being able to, quote unquote, hold multiple ethnicities within themselves at once, right? They actually do have multiple ethnic attachments. They are both Nego and Berenda. They are both Black and Muslim, and those are actual things that they can lay claim to. But you can look at a case like Rachel Dolezal and see that there are limits to how instrumental you can be with your ethnicity, right? Rachel Dolezal, if you don't know about this case, is a white American woman who for years masqueraded as if she were a Black American. She rose to the ranks of, I believe, the NAACP, and maybe it was Portland or Washington State. It was one of those kind of northwestern states. And when it was revealed that she was in fact white, it kind of led to the deterioration of some of the political capital that she had brought up, pretending as though she were a Black woman. And this is a really interesting case of instrumentalism because as a student at Howard University, she felt as though she was being, I believe, discriminated against for financial aid reasons in her art major. So she wasn't receiving the type of financial aid that she was supposed to. And so she brought litigation against Howard University in a discrimination suit, obviously claiming that she was a white woman. So there, she instrumentally used her white identity to try and get more financial aid from the university and support her discrimination claim. But then years later, she again um, adopted an identity of being a Black woman in order to rise up the ranks of local politics in the NAACP, or at least community activist politics in the NAACP. But like I said, once it was revealed that this woman here was born this way, it didn't work out well. People did not believe that she could just identify as a Black person. Another thing that kind of shows you how limited this can be is a really cool video that I'm just going to show you for fun. So take a second to look at this video and enjoy. Let's see, I'm hoping that this is working. Okay, so enjoy this little clip to kind of show you how difficult it can be to pretend to be something that you don't actually hold the ethnicity of.
Harrison looks from the outside to be your average teenager. He goes to school, plays video games, even listens to music in his room. But there's one difference.
I'm a 35-year-old white man.
Harrison, born Antoine Smalls, has transracial identity, identifying as Harrison Booth, a 35-year-old white man from Colorado. And when did you know that you were a 35-year-old white man?
Well, I've always felt different. I go to the store, the movies, and just be thinking to myself, like, why am I not getting the respect I deserve? And then it just hit me. I'm white and 35. I just miss Colorado sometimes. You know, here I pretend the buildings are the old San Juan mountain range, but, you know, the job's just here.
And where do you work?
I'm a systems engineer for Coca-Cola.
Oh, okay.
That boy don't work. He go to school and that's it. One day he said, call me Harrison. I said, who's that? He said, me.
Do you believe that he is a white man?
I mean, he isn't. Shit, I'd love to wake up one day and say, hey, everybody, I'm Rihanna. But I ain't.
It's been pretty hard. My family.
So yeah, so hopefully that video was funny to you. It was hilarious to me. And it kind of shows how difficult it is to basically adopt any ethnicity you want, right? Ethnicity isn't an entirely fluid category. There are some ethnicities, obviously, that we can adopt more easily than others. It is possible, for example, to learn new languages, to convert religions, things like this. So yes, you might be able to instrumentally acquire some new ethnic identity for certain things, but surely there are limitations, right? There is no way that anyone would believe that I, for example, was an Asian woman. It's impossible to conceive of that, given you know the color of my skin, given the fact that I don't, to my knowledge, have any Asian relatives. Like, all of those things are very hard to do. So one of the major problems that instrumentalism hits is that ethnicity does, there are some boundaries, right? And you can't just adopt ethnic identities kind of willy-nilly for your own purposes. And so to that, to kind of correct for this, we have one more theory that has kind of come up, which is the constructivist theory. Here, constructivism shares some elements with instrumentalism. It doesn't see ethnicity as fixed like primordialism does, actually sees it as being a creation or a construction that humans have devised and kind of solidified through different social and political processes. So here we have ethnicity. Again, it's not fixed, it's definitely fluid, and it's made salient by certain actors or institutions, but it is also bounded, right? So these ethnic differences can only be constructed within bounds. So while the idea of being Black is a construction, right, it's clearly been constructed as differently from white. And so you can't just quite adopt a white identity, but you could possibly overcome the differences between Black and white by emphasizing a different part of people's humanity, right? So you can emphasize the fact that we're all humans, right? And maybe then Black comes to mean less than it did before, and white comes to mean less than it did before. You might emphasize the fact that rather than being of different races, we are of, for example, perhaps the same religion, right? That people are overwhelmingly Christian in both of these groups. And so maybe we should adopt that identity and ally with one another rather than adopting something that makes us different. And so the place where we see this happening, this kind of play out most, is in the reading that you did by Daniel Posner, where he looks at Zambia and Malawi and how ethnic identification is actually different in these two countries. So Zambia and Malawi, as you can see here on the map, are two neighboring countries, right? We've already talked about Zambia once, but Malawi is right next door to the east. And the really interesting thing about these two countries is that they share certain ethnic groups between them. And that really, before colonialization, these ethnic groups were considered as one, kind of general whole, but then these areas were colonized and kind of artificial borders were drawn such that part of the ethnic group exists in Zambia, part in Malawi, and that is of two different ethnic groups. So he's trying to study these two different ethnic groups, Chiwas and Tumbukas, in Malawi and Zambia. And what he finds is that Chiwas and Tumbukas are rivals in Malawi. They oppose each other electorally. They compete against each other. There's even possibly limited conflict. But they are allies in neighboring Zambia. And that's weird because Chiwas and Tumbukas, like I said, pre-colonialization, they were the exact, the kind of preferences of those groups were consistent within the group. So all Chiwas had the same type of, they have the same heritage, they have the same type of ethnic markers, whatever. So being Chiwa is kind of constant. What it means to be Chiwa is constant across the border. What it means to be Tumbuka is also constant across the Malawi-Zambia border, but the relationships between these two groups are different in Malawi than they are in Zambia. And you can kind of see this through surveys, right? In Malawi, it appears that people are more likely to have negative opinions about their non-co-ethnics. So Chiwas are more likely to have negative opinions of Tumbukas and vice versa on a number of different issues. So a Chiwa respondent is more likely to say that interethnic marriage with a Tumbuka is a bad thing, that they would not be willing to marry Tumbukas, that they have negative opinions of other Tumbukas, that they do not believe that other people from their ethnicity would vote for a Tumbuka president, that they themselves wouldn't vote for a Tumbuka president. So in general, opinions tend to be more negative, whereas in Zambia, we see that opinions tend to be on the whole much more positive, right? They do not really have negative opinions about so they have generally positive opinions about interethnic marriage. More of them are willing to marry someone from a different ethnicity, from the opposite ethnicity. They tend not to have negative opinions of the other ethnicity. So on the whole, relationships between the two appear much more positive in Zambia than they do in Malawi. And the reason that Posner believes this is the case is because the electoral system creates competition between Chiwas and Tumbukas in Malawi, but it doesn't quite create those same incentives in Zambia. And we can see this very clearly because in Malawi, Chiwas and Tumbukas are a large part of the ethnic groups that exist, right? They are the two major ethnic groups that exist in Malawi. They often have to compete with each other for resources, right? They form big enough political coalitions that politicians are incentivized to run on purely ethnic bases, and that makes these two competitors in the political system, right? Eventually, because of their size, Chiwa candidates will run and try to appeal to the Chiwas in the population. Tumbuka candidates will run and try to appeal to Tumbukas. And so we see a political rivalry develop in the Malawi case. In Zambia, however, they're actually a very small part of the population, right? These two groups are not big enough to form their own independent electoral coalitions. And so we don't really see a lot of politicians arising that try to just appeal to Chiwas or just appeal to Tumbukas. And so instead, what these two groups choose to do is more ally together as a kind of Western coalition, or sorry, a kind of Eastern coalition of Zambia. And they try to work together to defeat kind of the groups that are spread throughout the rest of Zambia. So they tend to be more cooperative here, where it benefits them to ally with one another because their numbers are so small, but they tend to be rivals in Malawi because the ethnicity actually matters here, right? They form big enough coalitions for politicians to run on ethnic bases, for voters to vote on ethnic bases, etc. And we kind of saw this again with if you did look at that lecture on how electoral systems can affect divided societies, we saw the ways in which different electoral choices, institutions, etc., tend to really mobilize ethnic identity, right? And can really make those salient categories for politics. And so that is the reason why we see there's such negativity between Chiwas and Tumbukas in Malawi. It's because they're competing for resources, for political office, and that really kind of, like I said, raises the stakes. Like I said in that lecture, the bonus lecture on electoral systems, it raises the stakes of political competition in Malawi, creating much more ethnic tension, whereas in Zambia, it kind of diffuses those stakes, and so there's more ethnic harmony between these two groups. Now, what are the problems with institutionalism? Well, on the one hand, it's hard to predict beforehand how ethnicity will be made salient and when it will be made salient, right? It's kind of easy to backwards induce, oh, it's the institutions, but what we need to be able to do as political scientists is say, okay, we know that this institution is in place. This is exactly how this is going to affect ethnicity, and that might not be the case, right? Institutions very much act differently in different political contexts. In the case of Malawi and Zambia, it's kind of hard to compare them entirely because these two places have slightly different political histories, different leaders, etc. And so it's really hard to make clear predictions, even with a natural experiment like this, as to when ethnicity will be made salient and whom it will be, or how it will be made salient. The other thing that we learn about institutions is that they can often have unintended consequences, right? So an institution may be designed to do one thing and it may end up doing something else, right? And so if institutions do have these unintended consequences, it's hard to understand how we need to change them in order to eliminate the negative consequences. So for example, how it would have been very difficult to understand when Lebanon, for example, instituted its consociational system, would have been difficult to predict that would have ended up in turmoil, right? Nobody really foresaw that. And it's hard to understand, okay, how should that be changed to ease any ethnic tension, because again, institutions could have unintended consequences. So if you choose a new institutional design, you may end up with the same results. Finally, one of the problems with institutionalism is that ethnic identification can be sticky, and perhaps more sticky than the institution itself. So one of the good things about institutionalism is that it assumes that, okay, if we've chosen an institution that has mobilized ethnicity in a negative way, right, has produced more competition, more conflict, more violence, then all we have to do is change the institutional design, right? Pick a new strategy, and that should resolve most of the problems. But as we know, even if institutions begin to change, the kind of racial or ethnic identities that the previous institutions formed can actually stick with us for quite some time. And we can see that even in you know, the context that we live in today. So we can look at things like affirmative action policies, or something like intermarriage, right? It used to be the case that in the United States there used to be anti-miscegenation laws that meant that people could not marry across racial categories. Those have changed a lot, and we've seen a lot of a kind of rise in interracial marriage. And we might think, okay, the change of that institution would harmonize ethnic relationships or racial relationships in the United States. However, that has not always been the case, right? There are still people that have very negative perceptions of other races based on kind of the long legacy of racial discrimination in the United States. So even though certain institutions have changed, kind of the animosity that might exist between different sides, or the kind of patterns of racial identification that might exist, have not changed. So ethnicity can kind of outlast that institutional change in some circumstances. Okay, so I have presented you with 5 theories. I have poked holes in all of them. And you might be asking yourself, well, then what am I supposed to do with this? Well, what you're supposed to do is put on your thinking cap, your scholar's cap, and take all of these ethnicities and all of these theories and their critiques. And what I want you to do is, as we go into next week, trying to understand how ethnic conflict has arisen, try to use these theories to try and understand the rise of ethnic conflict in Rwanda, the rise of ethnic conflict in Yugoslavia, and the rise of ethnic conflict in India. So really quickly, to sum up what we've learned thus far, ethnicity is important for understanding political outcomes. To understand how ethnicity will work, you have to understand why people identify with their ethnicity in certain ways. We have a lot of different theories for that: modernization theory, Marxist theory, primordialist theory, instrumentalism, and social constructivism. And like I said, what I want you to do as we go into the next week is take all of these theories, look at their pros and their cons, and try to use them as a lens to explain ethnic conflict in the cases that we'll explore next week in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and India. The articles that we read will highlight different elements of these theories, and it's really going to be up to you as consumers of knowledge, right, to try and decide to critically analyze what you think is operating in these cases. Do you think that race is being used instrumentally in these cases? Is it a matter that ethnic conflict broke out because of the institutions that were chosen, or because, like primordialism suggests, that these people always were going to have objective differences and conflict was bound to break out due to the differences in the ethnic categories that existed? So for next class, we're going to focus on Rwanda. Just so you know, next week we'll be split into 3 short lectures, one on each of the cases that we look at. And I just, as always, admonish you to do the readings. I'll see you guys next week. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Bye.